Thank you for being here and welcome to the Cosmopolitan Traveller. Guys, today I'm here with a very good friend of mine,
Arnold Drenth.
Arnold Drenth. Arnold, how are you, man?
I'm well. I'm well.
You're
Thank
good?
you.
That's
Are
amazing.
you good?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, so guys, Arnold has a very interesting background. Arnold, would you mind telling us a bit more?
No. I'm obviously in Brazil now, and I've been here for 8 years, but of course I didn't start here. I was born in the Netherlands, which some people call Holland, and grew up in Australia and spent many years in Britain, in England in fact, and been here the last 8 years teaching English, teaching theatre, teaching drama, and enjoying Latin America.
That's amazing, very well. And Arnold, tell us more about it. And how long were you in Australia?
Well, I grew up in Australia really. I left the Netherlands almost before living memory. I was 3.5 years old. So my formative years were Australian really. My native language is really the Australian version of English. And I was in Australia from 3 to 25. So I was educated in Australia, did French and English at university level, and like many Australians, I travelled after I'd finished my study and a bit of work. Yes, I've travelled quite a bit.
That's really good, you know. And how long in England?
I've been in England more than 20 years. I have family there. My 2 adult children are living in England at the moment. I know England quite well. When I came back from Australia to Europe, I spent time in the Netherlands and in England teaching and working in various positions. I've worked in computing, I've worked in banking, I've worked in teaching. Quite a varied career, I guess I'd say.
That's nice, interesting. And Arnold, how you enjoy Brazil so far?
Brazil is a very interesting country. It's interesting for lots of different reasons. In some ways, I think what we're doing here is inventing a version of the future that other people will also take a lot of notice of. I've lived in São Paulo for all of the time here. It's noticeable how much more wealthy São Paulo is than the rest of the country. There are great disparities of wealth in Brazil, as I'm sure you know. But the kinds of improvisations that you see here are, I think, a clue to how we will cope with the pressures of urban living in the future. One example I'll give you, over the last year, maybe 1.5 years at most, suddenly from nothing, there are lots of people using electric scooters in São Paulo. And they're scooters that you hire. You don't buy them, or some people do, but mostly you hire them, and you scoot through the traffic at what looks like terrifying and dangerous speeds, and possibly they are.
A little bit, right?
Just a bit. The legal position is a bit unclear because I believe it's technically speaking illegal, but I'm not sure that anyone's been prosecuted for it.
Yeah.
It is a solution to the problem of urban mobility. I'm sitting here on Rua dos Pinheiros. I'm sure I will see some people going by on scooters anytime now. And you see them going through the heavy São Paulo traffic and mixing it with trucks and tanks and God knows what. I don't mean military tanks, I mean water tankers. It's an interesting way for the problems of urban mobility to be solved. I think we have a version of the future here that we can learn from in other developing cities.
Right, that's very good. Now, Arnold, tell us, how many countries have you been to?
I've lived in countries more than travelled to countries, and I've lived and worked because it seems to me that living and working in a country is where you really learn the most.
Sure.
I've obviously lived and worked in Australia and in the Netherlands, and I went back to the Netherlands to work. I wasn't working at 3.5 years old. Also in the UK a lot, and now in Brazil, but I've also visited other cities and countries, in France, for example, in Italy, specifically in Sicily, in Latin America. Here I've been to Uruguay and Argentina, and within Brazil to other cities as well. So I've travelled, but more as a live and work, stay put person than as a traveller doing the touristy things.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how many languages can you speak?
English is my native language, the Australian version of.
Pretty much, yeah.
I don't know what he's talking about. I also speak basic Portuguese, muito básico, muito ruim.
Come on, he's been here for 8 years.
No,
he's
no,
joking,
no.
he's messing up.
I speak French. I studied at university level. I do speak Dutch, which is a language most people find quite difficult to speak. I have a smattering of Italian, German. Probably I could read Spanish. I have 3 languages, I guess, that I'm strong in, and some others that I know a little bit about. What I think of as, say, menu Italian. I can speak menu Italian. I can order the right dish from the spaghetti menu.
You don't starve, right? That's
no,
important.
don't starve.
Yeah,
that's important. That's important.
Now, I've got one question here. What's the most interesting city to visit in your country? But when I say in your country, you come from the Netherlands, but you've lived in Australia and also in England. So, what are the most interesting cities to visit?
Well, in Australia, I'm prejudiced because I grew up there, but I find Adelaide a very interesting place because it's not like Sydney and Melbourne, which everybody knows, or the Gold Coast, which everybody knows, which are more or less modelled on international development. You would be at home in Sydney if you'd lived in New York, for example, because the systems are similar. Adelaide, on the other hand, being smaller, it's 1 million plus, is much more Australian in its character. So you would learn things about the Australian way of life that you wouldn't necessarily see in the same way in a short visit to Sydney or Melbourne. Right. So I would say Adelaide's a good place to visit in Australia.
In England?
Well, in England I've lived in London, which is of course a fantastic city, very interesting, all kinds of things to see and do there. Also very expensive, as I guess you know. There are other places that are worth seeing in Britain and in England specifically. It's worth it to go to the country because, like in every city, every country that I've visited, country people are different from city people, and you will learn more by going to the country in England about British people and what they're like than if you simply look at England. England is an exception, in the same way as Paris is an exception to France.
Absolutely.
São Paulo is an exception to Brazil.
Definitely.
So you want to learn about the character of a country, go to the cities by all means, but go to the countryside. To the countryside.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, Arnold, what about in the Netherlands?
Well, in the Netherlands, I know Amsterdam well. I've lived there for some time.
Right.
I do also know Rotterdam. I've lived there for some time. Both of those are interesting cities. There's a difference, quite a large difference, between Rotterdam and Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, you still see lots of old buildings.
Yeah.
In Rotterdam, you don't. And if you ask yourself why, and you look back at your history, you can see. During the opening days of the Second World War, the threat from Nazi Germany was, okay, we're going to invade your country. And they did, and they flew over in the bombers and they bombed Rotterdam flat. And that's why there is almost no historical building left in Rotterdam. And the ultimatum was, well, if you don't surrender, we'll do that to more cities. So the Dutch, being sensible, pragmatic people, said, okay, we stop.
We're going to stop.
We're good to stop. So they're both interesting cities, but from different points of view. Rotterdam's very modern. Its architecture is very interesting because of that. There's some very adventurous architecture in Rotterdam. Amsterdam is interesting because parts of it are still a functioning 17th century trading city. The inner parts of the city are mostly what used to be warehouses, and you can see it from the construction. They're 3 or 4 stories high. They have very large doors that open out onto the canal side, so the ship could come up, unload its goods. They would be hoisted via rope, and you will see at the top of a lot of Amsterdam townhouses, you'll see a wheel. That wheel is for the rope to go over, so that when you haul up the goods, you can use a rope and pulley system. So it's fully functional still as a 17th, 18th century city. It's kind of interesting from that point of view. Obviously it's changed, but it's also very organised, very clean, everything works, the public transport is good, it's pretty safe. It is quite a wealthy inner city, like in many parts of the world. The nicest parts of São Paulo are generally the more prosperous parts. So I recommend either of those as a place to go and see. But again, it is worth it to see other places in the Netherlands, and it's actually very easy in the Netherlands because it's small.
Yeah, it
you
is.
get across it in 2 hours by train. So
the whole Europe actually
is very close together.
Nice.
We're not talking Brazilian distances or Australian distances or American distances here. It's bem perto. Bem perto.
Bem perto. Good Portuguese, really close, right? No.
I told you it was rubbish.
Come on, man, that's great. Now, Arnold, what was your best trip?
Best trip I ever had.
Yeah.
in terms of what was most interesting and appealing to me, the most interesting time I ever had was in Sicily. Sicily is one of those places, it's part of Italy, but it's very definitely different from the rest of Italy. Why is that? Well, it's an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, and because of the history of the Mediterranean region, it's had lots of different peoples conquer it, invade it, live in it. It's had an Arabic past, it's had a Norman past, and there is still some surviving Norman architecture. Obviously it has an Italian past. There have been other countries that have swept through it on their way to one thing and another. And originally it was known as the breadbasket of the empire for the Romans, because you could grow a lot of grain there, which the Romans were desperately in need of for the bread for their populations, especially Rome. So it's kind of interesting to go there. And Italy in general is to me an interesting destination. We'll probably come back to that.
That's great, really nice. And Arnold, as we all know, while we are traveling, sometimes, not all the time, it's a very good and pleasant time.
Yes.
So have you ever been in a difficult situation while traveling?
Yes, and it happened relatively early on. We were travelling to Portugal. And, Portugal, it's a first world country. It's quite developed. It has everything it needs. We land at the airport in Portugal, in Lisbon, and get the taxi from Lisbon to Cascais, which is a little place outside Lisbon. And when we get to the hotel in Cascais, we say, hang on, have you got the camera? No. Have you got the camera? No. Okay, when was the last time you saw it? I put it on the roof of the car when we were getting into the taxi, and I was putting my suitcases in the back. But I didn't take it off the roof. Did you take it off the roof? No. Did it come off the roof? No, because when I got in, I don't remember seeing it on the roof. It's been stolen.
No way.
And this was annoying. It was a good camera, a Nikon FM2 for those who know. So this was a trip in which we didn't take too many photographs, but it also gave us a lesson very early on. When you're travelling, be careful, be aware. There is always somebody willing to take advantage, or there's something stupid that you do, and usually it's a combination of the two. This was a combination of the two, that makes you more aware that you are not in your everyday situation. You are travelling and things change.
You're dealing with different things as well, right?
That's right.
So you need to be aware.
You need to be organised.
That's great. And what was the most interesting place you have ever visited?
I do think Sicily is probably close to the top of the list. There are some other places too which I can mention, but Sicily is interesting because of its great cultural mix. There is for example, some architecture there that's in a very well preserved state, not because it's been looked after, but because they haven't had the money to develop. So in the past, it was very rich. There's some beautiful Baroque architecture there in the churches and some of the palaces, and it's still there. There's another place that I can mention which is like that here in Brazil, Ouro Preto.
Ouro Preto, Minas Gerais.
It's a very, very nice city.
Interesting.
And what you see is that it's still, in essence, the core of it, the historical core, is a functioning Baroque city centre, with the architecture still intact, with all the systems still in place, like the drainage and the roads and the domestic dwellings, and it's been adapted for that environment in a very clever way. Ouro Preto was built on a rocky, it's not a mountain exactly, but it's hilly. The houses are built on these sloping stone sites, and naturally the ground floor that you enter from street level is level, and below the cellar slopes. And there are two things about that sloping cellar space. One is that's where the servants, for which read in those days slaves, lived, and it was not comfortable for them at all.
So it has a huge historical content.
And it has huge historical content, and actually it's very important for the history of Brazil, as people who know the history of Brazil probably realise. When it rains in Ouro Preto, it rains very heavily, and so the rain comes streaming down the cobbled streets, and actually it goes through the houses. These houses that are built up on piles with a sloping cellar, they let the water drain through. That has two good effects. One is that you don't get flooding in the the streets,
Yeah.
and two is that it cools the house down.
Oh, clever.
So it's actually a rather pleasant place to live for those upstairs.
Yeah, absolutely, very well. Now, Arnold, what's the most beautiful country you have ever visited?
Hard to say. Depends what your idea of beauty is, but if I wanted to say, where do I want to go back to? Where's the feeling where I feel most like, this is heaven? I would probably go back to Australia and into the bush, what we call the bush in Australia. To you and me.
What is the bush?
The bush is like the countryside, or in Portugal you'd say the mata maybe.
Mata?
The jungle. It's not quite jungle, it's not as thick as that. It's usually a bit drier. Australia's pretty dry. But when you walk through those stands of eucalypt trees and you breathe that in, and you can hear the birds singing, and sometimes you see them flying in flocks through the branches, you might, if you're lucky, a kangaroo hopping by in the distance.
Wow.
When my family first went to Australia, they were told that they should expect to see kangaroos hopping down the main street, and that the children would ride horses to school. Not true. None of it's true. None of it's true. But we did see kangaroos. If you go out into the bush, you would see them still. That feels a bit like kind of a heaven to me. I guess it's because I grew up there. It's my formative years.
So you missed that?
I do. I miss the countryside. You don't get that in São Paulo, neither do you get it in London, neither do you get it in Amsterdam. We live in cities these days, and the people who are still living in the country, by and large, are pouring into the cities.
Yeah.
It's a problem, and we need to make sure that we're more in contact with nature than we are at the moment.
Very well. And now, do you prefer hot or cool places?
Well, I can speak from experience because the Netherlands is cold. I was born in the Netherlands and lived in the Netherlands. I grew up in Australia. South Australia is the driest state in the driest continent, and it's quite hot. 100 plus Fahrenheit, of course, is not unusual. England is cold and wet in the winter. It's pleasant in the summer. And Brazil is pretty warm most of the year. So I've got warm and cold, and I can safely say I enjoy both.
I don't really mind.
I've learnt as a traveller to appreciate wherever I am.
Well,
it's one of the secrets of travelling well.
That's a good one. But you know what? I must tell you what. I've grown up in Brazil, you know, so I mean the hot weather is something that sometimes it's too much, you know, as I lived in Canada as well. Over there, I mean, you can, when it's cold, you can put some coats and other things, you know, you can get going, but when it's too hot, you don't have much to do, right?
Yes. There's a saying in English that comes to mind here, there's no such thing as bad weather,
Yeah,
only inappropriate clothing.
Yeah.
You dress well, you'll be fine.
Absolutely. And now, Arnold, what countries would you most like to visit?
There's almost nowhere that I'm not interested in. I'm really only not interested in places where my life would be in danger. Like I'm not sure I'd want to visit a war zone, or somewhere that was heavily polluted or very heavily regulated.
Okay.
I don't think North Korea would be a lot of fun. I'm not sure that going to Lake Baikal in the middle of Eurasia would be good. It's a very polluted lake.
Right.
I wasn't very interested in going to Shanghai until recently because the air is, if it's possible, worse than here in São Paulo. So there are places that I wouldn't go, but there are plenty of places that I would go. What's on my list? I would like to go back to Italy and to see the rest of Italy. I've only seen Sicily really. I'd like to see the north, the south, the middle. There's a cultural reason for that as well as the reasons of food and wine, which are very compelling. What we think of now as Western civilization, which frankly is the model that a lot of people are following everywhere, really had its birth in Greece and was developed in Italy by the Romans. We're living now via a slightly different version of the same thing. I'm kind of interested in knowing how that arose and how it came to be how it is. Of course we can't see it anymore because Rome as it exists isn't there anymore, but even just to see the remains of that and to understand what remains of that spirit in Italy now would be very interesting.
Right, and Arnold, as you've traveled a bit already, is there any differences between young and adult tourists?
Yeah, I can sum it up with one example. The young love to go to Disneyland. The adults go there under sufferance. And I speak from experience.
You must go for it.
No. Believe me, it's not worth it. Disneyland Paris was horrible.
Really?
Horrible. The service was bad, the queues were long, The attractions were not that attractive, and it took a long time to go to and from. So no, it wasn't on my list of must-do places. Don't go there.
All right. And do you think the type of vacation one take reflects one's social status?
Yes, I think it does. We all know that travel costs money. Whether you're flying, which is expensive, or whether, as is happening more these days, you're going by other means, by train, by boat, maybe by public transport, or motorbike or bicycle. It all takes some money to get yourself established and going.
Yeah.
You can do it very cheaply, especially if you use public transport, but it takes more patience and organisation to do that well. So, more or less by definition, you've got to be reasonably well off to be travelling. Why do we see more Chinese visitors now in other parts of the world? Because China's becoming a richer country. So people are able to afford to travel more.
Oh, that's interesting. And as this said, why do people travel?
Well, the cliche is that travel broadens the mind. Yeah, but it has to be willing to be broadened.
Yeah.
You know, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but it really wants to change. So there's a presupposition that travel is by definition good. Not necessarily. If I was living in São Paulo, my choice would not be, let's go to Miami, because Miami is another developed, maybe overdeveloped city, which has similar things to São Paulo, but maybe slightly broader range of things to do, slightly cheaper, slightly more American in its orientation. I would prefer to be going to somewhere that I hadn't seen like before.
Like Iceland,
for example.
or Alaska,
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know, the Himalayas, something
New
like
Zealand.
New Zealand, have you been there?
No, I should. I have relatives in New Zealand. It's one of those things. People that say, where have you seen in Brazil? And I give a list, and you've seen more than I have. If you live in the country yourself, you tend not to travel as much as people who are tourists.
That's so funny, you know, because I talk to a lot of my European friends,
Yes.
and then they don't travel that much as we Brazilians, for example.
Yes.
Even though, for example, they live in France, they don't make an effort to go to Italy or Germany, for example.
Yes.
It's funny
Which
thing.
is the same kind of distance as today I'm going to go from São Paulo to Fortaleza.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Distance is not the issue. The issue is about, I don't know, cultural proximity almost, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, because I tell my friends that once I did a trip from São Paulo to Fortaleza, it was a 3-day
car
trip,
Yeah.
car trip, and then they get really freaked out, because they don't see themselves doing it. So
In Australia, sometimes we would go from Adelaide to Melbourne. That's an overnight trip to go to a party.
to go to a party.
Seriously, yes, we did. It's you get used to being on a certain scale. The scale in the Netherlands is very much smaller. Like I say, you can cross the country in 2 hours by train.
Yeah, that's great. And now, Arnold, what are your best travel tips?
It all comes back to the same thing, really, about being organised. But practically speaking, travel light. I don't know about you, but I hate airports. I don't like airports because you can never get good food and drink there, and what you can get is usually overpriced. You're usually tired. You're a little bit stressed because you don't quite know what's happening next. You need to be organised. You know what? The less organisation you have, the better. So if you can travel without putting luggage in the hold, then do it. Put everything in the overhead locker, cram everything that you need into that one bag, take another bag or two, you can usually get away with 2 more, and go straight out of the airport to the taxi rank or the bus or whatever you're going to do, and go. Airports are horrible. Don't go there.
All right. And what's the most enlightening things that your trips have taught you?
Back to this thing about travel broadens the mind. I've learnt to like and to enjoy wherever I am. I think of myself as always being on holiday because I've always been from somewhere else. In Australia, I was from the Netherlands. In England, I was from Australia. In Brazil, I'm from England. So I'm always a foreigner. I'm always a gringo. What did I learn about that? There are things to appreciate in every place that you are.
Right.
Almost everywhere has things of beauty, things of interest, things that are stimulating, things that you've never seen before. There are things that are the same. I look out the window and I go, apartment blocks, they look like they could be apartment blocks in Sydney or in London. It's not that different. but there are lots of things that are very, very particular to São Paulo. The food is just one obvious thing. One other thing that I must say here about Brazil, what I love about Brazil, is the different musical styles that you have in Brazil are absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
There must be 15 different native styles of Brazilian music, all of them distinct, all of them with their own repertoire and their own instruments and their own way of doing things, and they're wonderful.
Yeah.
I always flinch a bit when people say, oh, who's your favourite music in Brazil? They say, oh, the Beatles. Oh, come on, don't you know your own culture, please? And then usually people do know their own culture as well.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that it's quite as appreciated as it should be. The musical culture of Brazil is incredibly rich. It's a great cultural treasure that you have in Brazil, which I would like to see appreciated more. So people, if you come into Brazil, listen to the music before you begin, and I did that, and then when you come in, go and see live music as much as you can. And there is live music everywhere.
Yeah, you're right.
You know, on this street, we're on Rua dos Pinheiros at the moment. In Pinheiros, there are about half a dozen live music venues, and this is one street. There's always live music to be heard somewhere, and it's usually quite high quality.
Yes.
And I guarantee, if you haven't been looking at Brazilian music or been to Brazil, you won't have heard anything like it before. Worth going to listen to. So come and enjoy.
That's really nice. Now, Arnold, our interview is getting to an end,
Okay.
and I've got the last question for you. What can we learn from Dutch, Australian, and British people, since you are a bit of all of them, right?
A little of each of them.
Yeah.
Okay. The one thing that makes all those countries the way they are, which I guess we could call developed, is that they're organised.
Organised.
They have a public transport system that works. It's clean. It has a public health service that works. There are people to insure you for travel insurance, for example. You can find your way about by public transport. You can take a taxi. You can find places to stay. If you are in trouble, there's somebody you can go to. It's always easier to live in an organised country than in a disorganised country. Of course, there are things about disorganised countries that are interesting. You will find things that you haven't seen before. You'll have experiences that you didn't have before. You're not going to like all of them. Some of them won't be so nice.
Yeah.
But all those cultures and the cities that go with them are organised in a way that makes life more enjoyable. And since none of us have infinite time, as much of it as is enjoyable, yes, please. Thank you very much.
That's great, Arnold. Thank you very much for your time, Arnold. For those who want to try a very good German food here in São Paulo, Pinheiros, you should come to IMBISS. Yes, come to IMBISS, have some German food,
And beer.
beer as well. Yes,
Yes.
we can't miss that. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and if you want to reach Arnold, I'll leave his email right here. Also his blog. He has a really nice blog. You should take a look. And thank you very much, Arnold.
Thank you.
It was a huge pleasure, and yeah, we'll see you around.
And if you want to come to IMBISS, Rua dos Pinheiros 327. See you there.
Good job. Alright, so if you've liked this video, please hit the like button down here, share with your friends, and have a good time. Alright, so have a good trip and bon voyage. Very good, man. Good. Okay. 20